Hey guys, sorry it's taken so long. This is probably going to be the last video on the Summer River series. So I just wanted to talk about, what do river smallmouth do when there's a bunch of dams and a general lack of current. What do smallmouth do then? Because not everyone gets to just go upstream and find oxygenated water. Like, that's what I would like to do most of the time when I'm fishing for summer river smallmouth. Is I want to go find the oxygenated water, but some people don't have that access. So I wanted to make a video for those guys before I wrap up this series. And so there's really like 3 or maybe 4 things, depending on how you want to look at it, that I'm going to be targeting. Starting with the most obvious, bridge pillars is going to be the first one. Anywhere you have bridge pillars, those are going to be hot spots for summer smallmouth. And, just like always, they're going to be pointed upstream. They're going to be using that as a current break. So even if you just have a kayak or a little tin can, like that's a super obvious place you can go fish, and you can pretty much guarantee that there's going to be fish there. With a lot of this, dammed up water, slower moving water, the slack water, typically to escape the heat, those smallmouth are going to go lower in the water column. So, oftentimes they'll be anywhere from like 25 to 45, 50 feet deep to escape that summer heat. With bridge pillars, though, you do get a little bit of aerated water near the surface, so you do get, some suspended smallmouth. With that in mind, if I wanted to fish for some of those suspended smallmouth, and really just for all of these techniques, or for all of these spots in general, this is kind of my go-to search bait, is a little paddle tail. Now this is a Kitech 3.3, but in the summer I really like a Kitech 3.8. I think there's a little bit more versatility with rigging that. Depending on how much current I have, if I can get away with it, I might go as light as a 1/4 ounce. If I have to go up, if there's more current and I'm trying to fish the bottom, I might go 3/8. Or, if absolutely need be, I can stick a 1/2 ounce football head on that Kitech 3.8 and I can grind it through the rock piles. But when we're talking about like bridge pillars, I'm usually using that paddle tail on, the lighter end for more of like the suspended fish. That's not particularly my favorite way to catch them, but it can be a way to go about things quickly. But, for the most part, when I'm fishing bridge pillars, I'm trying to get down to the bottom. And that's where, I really like my tubes once again. There's a tube on a jig head. I really like these Poor Boys Goby profile tube heads. They're really flat. They work really well. If you're using a bait caster, you can use that Tokyo rig yet again. You can throw, that compact jig if you want. Get it down there, bounce it through the rock piles. You can absolutely throw that drop shot. I still have that Carolina rig here from that other video. So you can see, I got a weight and a swivel and a bait down here, and I'll just drag that through the rock piles. So really, realistically, when we're talking about, dammed up slack water, I think the fishing does become a lot simpler because, it's pretty predictable where they're going to be. Like we just said, bridge pillars, offshore rock piles, like especially if you find a big flat with rock piles, that can be another good one. And, I'll use the same baits that I'm using on bridge pillars. on those on those offshore rock piles, I do have a little more leniency with the paddle tails and covering water there. If to find those offshore rock piles, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and idle around with my boat and use my 2D sonar to see if I can't find, places where there's, little rock piles and like an arc sitting on top of those. And that lets me know that there's a big smallmouth feeding in there. And so those areas, when I get to them, once again, using those same kind of baits, I'm going to be more spot fishing those specifically. And depending on how much current's in there, I might just cast, upstream and just drag my bait through the rock pile and, rinse and repeat. But I think the fishing is simpler because you don't have as much current. It's just, and it's harder in the sense that you have to find, work harder to find the spots where the smallmouth are hanging out. But yeah, all of those can be, really good staples. If you are in a kayak or you don't have a 2D sonar, you can still, like bust out a good old-fashioned topo map, go find a spot that looks like it's got, a big flat that you think might have some rock piles, and you can get out there in your kayak and you can use, that tube as your sonar, if you will. So, that can be an awesome way of getting her done, even if you don't have, a big old fancy boat. You can absolutely use some of this stuff. It works just fine. Or, you can use if you want to speed up, you can use your little paddle tail, and you can use your Carolina rig. So, there's a lot of variety in this kind of stuff when we're talking about summer smallmouth and slack water and offshore fishing. Those rock piles are a little bit harder to find. I'll talk here about some more obvious spots, but if I'm trying to find those, usually what I'm doing is I'm going to idle around with my boat in an area that I think is going to have some of those. And keep in mind, this is in proximity to areas that I've seen especially big smallmouth spawning, because I'm assuming you're probably fishing places that you're familiar with. Those big smallmouth, yes, smallmouth do migrate to an extent, but the big ones try and migrate as little as possible. So you really aren't going to see them travel the 100 miles that a smallmouth can migrate in a year. You're going to see them trying to hang out within a couple miles of where they're spawning. And so just keep that in mind. And if you're fishing somewhere new, try and like reverse engineer it. So think about it like, there's a spawning bay. It's got gravel, it's got sand, it's got rock, it's got a little bit of everything. And out here it looks like there's a big flat that like, maybe there's some rock piles on. Or with regards to those spawning bays, it can also be as simple as, there's a creek that runs in here. We know that smallmouth like to spawn there. On either side of the creek, there's, steep canyon walls, and there's, those steep canyon walls adjacent to the spawning bays can be good spots. And those can be great spots to look for schools of bait fish, too. Smallmouth will absolutely crush panfish like crappie and perch. So if you can find, a little cloud of panfish sitting out, 25 to 45 foot deep, and underneath it there's a big old arch, that very well could be a big old smallmouth feeding on that stuff. So, and the, last spot to talk about would be like, little points. Here in the Pacific Northwest, most of our river reservoirs are just canyons, and every once in a while there will be like a little point. And that little point can be a little hot spot. The tricky thing, like I was talking about before, the reason I say it's harder to find the spots is because you tend to have to go a lot further distances between spots, and you have to check out a lot more spots just to be able to find a lot of these big ones. And that's why I don't really like the downriver stuff as much, fishing out of a tin can. But you can absolutely get her done. I've done it, and I know plenty of people who have. I know plenty of people who do. But you can get your topo map. You can use it to find flats. You can use it to find creeks running in. But getting back to I've kind of talked a little bit about each kind of place I look for now. I'm gonna dig into it just a little bit more. So those bridge pillars are probably the simplest. Pretty much, just like those eddies upstream, those fish are just waiting for the current to bring them along some kind of food or something. And a lot can be, the same thing can be said about offshore rock piles. The same thing can be said about points. And the same thing can be said about those steep canyon walls adjacent to spawning bays. I think there can absolutely be a lot of dead water. And by dead water, I mean like you might be catching bass, but they might not be much over like 12, 13 inches. There's a lot of cookie cutters just about anywhere you go. But this is really geared at finding bigger bass, and so I'm personally trying to think about it in terms of where do they like to spawn, where are the big spawning bays at, and where in the summer are they going to go to feed. And so those bridge pillars are simplest. You can throw a lot down there. You will lose stuff in the rock piles. Those offshore rock piles, whether they're on flats or just anywhere you find them, those are gonna eat up some baits. You're gonna lose some baits to the rocks, but same concepts kind of apply. You're just dragging something through, and when it hits that rock pile that the fish is on, hopefully they're gonna grab it. You can eliminate a lot of that dead water by using that Kitech on a jig head to like really grind through and just see where is a hard structure at, where just get a feel for things that you're bumping into down there. And that's going to be a really good search bait and reaction bait. Where things get a little more tricky is when we talk about those points and those bluff walls adjacent to the spawning bays. Once again, we're still looking 25 to 50 foot deep. On those points, they might get out on the very head of that point, since there's not a whole lot of current. They're still going to point upstream if there's just the tiniest bit of current. They might get up on the very head of that and wait for stuff to come up. There might also be schools of baitfish sitting in the theoretical eddy behind that point in the slack water, and that might be where you find like the panfish, and those bigger bass might be chilling out, wanting to gobble those up in the mornings and evenings, really whenever they get a chance. But in those mornings or evenings, you might see smallmouth push shallower to get those guys. And same can be said about those, canyon walls adjacent to spawning bays. If you can find a school of, crappie or panfish, once again, that spook can be a lot of fun on top water, bright and early in the morning, in the afternoon. But middle of the day, I think they're still going to try and hunker down. You've probably heard a term, a spot within a spot. They might try and hunker down on whatever rock pile is near that school of bait fish. And so, once again, I'm going to use a lot of the same stuff. I think it's kind of pretty straightforward. That's why I haven't gone through too much detail here. But if you're just trying to locate fish, in those areas, you can use this guy. You can use that paddle tail. And then once you find some rock piles that those smallmouth relate to, then you can slow it down with your tube, your finesse jig, your drop shot. So, there's it seems daunting because there's a whole lot of water, but there's really only a handful of places that I'm going to go that I think I stand a fighting chance on in the slack water. But I wanted to finish on this because there's a lot of guys on like the Columbia River. There's a lot of guys on like the lower Snake River, Brownlee, a lot of other big reservoirs on dams that just have like the slowest current ever. Your big reservoirs on rivers that just have like the tiniest amount of current. And really what you're thinking about is you're trying to mix like the idea of like lake fishing with river fishing. So fish very much are pointed upstream still. They have more freedom to move around, and they will in places where they have a theoretical eddy or whatnot, or they're much more willing to like whip around and follow your bait. Like they will do that. But yeah, for the most part, when we're talking slack water, summer smallmouth, bridge pillars, offshore rock piles, what little points we can find, and those steep walls adjacent to spawning bays. And I want to clarify that, like, when I say adjacent to spawning bays, I mean you want to be fairly close, within like quarter mile, I guess. Like they may migrate more than that if they want. If there's something nearby that's just really nice, they might. But for the most part, like they're big, they're lazy, they don't want to move. And when I get to those spots, I'm just gonna idle around and I'm looking for rock piles. I'm looking for bait fish. But even if I can't find that stuff, those bridge pillars and those offshore rock piles are going to have crawdads, and, they're just going to wait for the river to bring them stuff. So there's plenty of opportunity. It's pretty straightforward fishing. It's just eliminating a lot of dead water. So give that a shot, and hope you enjoy.